We're talking about the latest fighting in eastern Ukraine. Any solution to the crisis will likely involve a major Russian role. And joining me now from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst for Voice of Russia Radio. Dmitry, welcome to the show. There is now a major diplomatic push to resolve this crisis in Ukraine. We have the German and French leaders, as well as the US Secretary of State, have been holding talks in Kiev. They move on to Moscow. What will Russia make of this?
Well, Russia has always been for peace in the east of Ukraine. These are not East Ukrainians or Russians bombarding Kiev. These are the forces dispatched by Kiev bombarding Donetsk and Luhansk. And even now, when the self-defense forces in the southeast of Ukraine, when they surrounded a pretty large contingent of Ukrainian troops, Russia has called for an immediate ceasefire in Debaltseve, you know, the area where the Ukrainian troops were surrounded. So if anyone is to blame for the terrible tragedy that is happening, it is certainly not Russia. Russia did not initiate the so-called change in Ukraine. It was Victoria Nuland who today came with Secretary of State John Kerry to Kiev. It was her who initiated that terrible change.
I'm wondering how far the two sides are apart on the basic facts of what is going on the ground in Ukraine. As we just heard in the first part of our show, John Kerry, the US Secretary of State, laid out some conditions, and he said one of those conditions has to be that foreign troops withdraw from the border area, heavy weapons are taken out of the border area, and the border has to be closed to heavy weapons.
Well, the question is that, you know, the United States and the European Union are now very concerned about Ukrainian sovereignty. They were not concerned about Ukrainian sovereignty in the end of 2013, when Western leaders directly participated in the so-called protests in Kiev, protests that involved throwing Molotov cocktails and basically toppling the legitimately elected government of Ukraine. They suddenly became concerned about Ukrainian sovereignty now. But of course, there is a lot of foreign fighters fighting in the east of Ukraine, not necessarily Russians. There are fighters even from Europe, and there are lots of documents showing that. That's why it was absolutely inadmissible to have this radical government in power in Kiev. It was this government which only represents the west of Ukraine, which only represents the radically pro-Western political forces in Ukraine. It was this government that sort of brought about this civil war when it became impossible to represent the interests of the southeast of Ukraine by political means, as it had been the case during 23 years of Ukrainian independence.
What does Russia make of the negotiating tactics by Western countries? And on the one hand, we've got these Western leaders who are calling for a diplomatic solution to this crisis. On the other hand, the EU has just announced new sanctions against 19 people, 5 of them including Russians. They've announced that the Rapid Reaction Force will be deployed in neighboring countries. And I'm wondering, does Russia see the EU and the United States acting in good faith here?
Well, you also have to add here rumors, not only rumors, but suggestions to send American weapons to this new Ukrainian regime in order to fight its own people in the southeast of Ukraine. That's a major threat to Russia, because this is all taking place right next to our border. People fleeing from that region, most of them flee to Russia. There are at least 800,000 Ukrainian refugees living in Russia, you know, which the West keeps calling an aggressive state. It's a very strange situation when the refugees are coming to the aggressor. But in general, yes, it's quite clear that the United States and the EU are acting in concert. And the problem is that they are not pushing for a compromise. They are pushing for a victory of the side that they support in this conflict. I would remind you that tomorrow we expect President Hollande of France and Chancellor Merkel of Germany here in Moscow. But before leaving, Mr. Hollande said that the solution they are going to suggest is going to be based on territorial integrity of Ukraine. Well, people who live in Donetsk, people who live in Luhansk, and they've lost about 5,000 people in this war already, these people would not like to live under the regime which is now in power in Kiev. It's like asking the people in Sarajevo in 1992 or 1993 to live under Serbian regime. So basically, if the West keeps pushing the same agenda, 100% victory for Mr. Poroshenko and his people in Kiev, this is not going to work simply because people in the southeast of Ukraine will not agree. It's not Russia's insistence, it's their insistence. They don't want to live in a country which has been waging a war on them.
I want to get back to that in a moment, but first, just to the point that you raised about the U.S. threat to supply lethal aid, as it calls it, to Ukraine. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Alexander Lukashevich says any decision by the United States to supply weapons to Ukraine would, and I'm quoting here, inflict colossal damage to Russian-American relations. What will Russia do if weapons are supplied to Ukraine?
Well, imagine that there is a war going on in Texas on the border with Mexico, and Russia starts supplying weapons there. I don't know how far the Russian government can go, because people who are being killed in Donbass, they speak the same language as us. They went to the same school as us. They read the same books. They watch the same television. We don't separate ourselves from them. So if the United States starts supplying weapons to kill these people, I don't know what the reaction will be. It will be probably much tougher than anything we have seen before with Afghanistan or with Yugoslavia or anything else. It's just uncomparable. It's like bombing Texas and seeing what the United States would do.
So what is the bottom line for President Vladimir Putin here? What does he want? Does he want to see the republics of Donetsk and Luhansk become independent republics? Does he want to see it become part of Russia? What is his main demand?
Well, right now, the huge majority of Russians, and I think also Putin, we want to see the conflict frozen. We want the bombing of Donetsk to stop. We want the people in that huge metropolis dying every day. We want them to stop dying. That will be the first demand, to freeze the conflict, to stop the troops where they are now, maybe to move their Ukrainian artillery at least 20 kilometers away from Donetsk. So this is the first and the only wish of Russia. Then Ukrainians themselves, because we still consider people living in Donetsk and Luhansk Ukrainian citizens, they should negotiate with Kiev, not with Mr. Kuchma, the former president, who has been demonized by the Western press and by the Ukrainian nationalist press for 30 years. We don't want him to represent the new Ukrainian authorities in talks with so-called separatists. We want Mr. Poroshenko or someone else genuinely representing Kiev to meet with people representing Donetsk and Luhansk and decide how they are going to live in future. Maybe this will be a federal state. Maybe this will be a confederation. It doesn't matter right now so much. Right now what matters is to stop fighting, to stop the destruction of homes and the destruction of human lives in Donetsk and Luhansk.
What we hear from the United States and from the European Union all the time is that Russia needs to do this, Russia needs to do that, and the question is, how much control does Russia have over the rebel forces in eastern Ukraine?
I don't think Russia has a lot of control, because I would remind you that President Putin, in May this last year, he spoke against holding a referendum on independence. But people in Donetsk and Luhansk, they felt so much threatened by the new regime in Kiev. They wanted some kind of legitimacy for themselves. So they held this referendum against Putin's will. Right now, it's, people in Lugansk and Donetsk, they're just trying to survive. And that's why their wishes and their desires coincide with the wishes and desires of Russia. But again, I would remind you that Russia is only reacting. It was not Russia who started the revolutionary process in Ukraine. Somehow, Ukraine maintained a sort of political balance. Since 1991, when it gained independence, until 2014, there were, of course, huge differences between the west of Ukraine and the east of Ukraine. There were fistfights in the parliament, but these were fistfights in the parliament. When the United States and when the European Union, when they toppled the old regime in Ukraine, when they destroyed this political balance, there was no other way for people in the east to defend themselves but to use weapons, when Kiev sent an army there. And when Kiev sent an army to quell the unrest in eastern Ukraine, a lot of people in Russia just refused to believe it. We still can't believe that, inside the country that we considered our own, our big country, inside the former Soviet Union, people speaking the same language, people who studied in the same schools, are now killing each other in thousands. That's a tragedy for us, not only for Ukraine.
You know, on the one hand, we have the United States and the EU saying that we want negotiations, but at the same time, they're squeezing Russia. They have announced the deployment of this rapid reaction force, as I mentioned. EU has also announced sanctions. On the other hand, what kind of leverage does Russia have against Ukraine? Can Russia use economic means to, or any kind of economic leverage against Ukraine?
Well, the problem is that the new regime in Ukraine is already severing, cutting just about all the economic ties that connected Ukraine to Russia. And this is damaging the Ukrainian economy. Even the new regime's own statistics, which certainly look better than the reality, even these statistics reveal that the Ukrainian GDP is going to fall more than 4% this year. Why? Because a huge part of the Ukrainian industry has been geared to Russia. You know, products that Ukrainians produce, they were not sold under the Soviet Union in countries like France or Germany, or in what is now the European Union. They were sold in Russia. We buy these products. We know them. So when the new authorities in Ukraine, first they stopped all military technical cooperation with Russia, then they said they don't want to buy Russian gas anymore, they want to buy gas from other countries. They are destroying old economic ties, which are beneficial to both Ukraine and Russia. So it's not Russia's leverage, it's the policy of the new regime in Ukraine that is destroying that country now.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, thanks for joining us, sir. And that is all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at cctv-america. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.